speaking with Dr. Michelle Johnson. Dr. Johnson, where exactly are we, and what is the significance of where we are?
Well, we're at the corner of Ferry and 7th Street in Niles, Michigan, which is not a designated historic district, but by my estimation, a very good candidate for a historic district. We're sitting right now in what was identified as the first colored school that was established in 1867 by folks that were particularly interested in providing an education for young black people here in Niles. It didn't exist as a school, as a colored school for long, just a couple of years before then integration occurred here in Niles.
Okay, now at the time when this was a school for colored kids, were there black teachers or was it white teachers?
This is what we hope to find out. My suspicion, and from what I understand from Carol Bainbridge, is that yes, they were black teachers and black organizers, but this is one of the exciting things we want to find out, is who in fact these folks were and why did they do it. It seems that there's very much part of what we see as a national trajectory for black folks at that point, with a real strong emphasis on having us get the education that had been denied to us for so long. So I don't know yet, but that we know that this building was established for those students. So even if the teachers were not African American and the founders were not black people, the students were. And then to be able to find out who those students were and to be able to track them and find out what their lives were, what the lives of their parents were like here in this area. So we're just talking about one building right now where we stand. Kitty corner from us, which I don't exactly know which direction that might be, is Mount Calvary Baptist Church, which is not the original church, but was established in 1851 as the Second Baptist Church by your great-great-great-grandfather and Mr. Lett, who we have a descendant for in Kalamazoo, in fact. So that church, also significant. The Hackleys, particularly important because of their connections in Virginia and Kentucky and Ohio, because it's so important when we're starting to tell the Michigan story that we include those places, because our histories in those places are so interconnected with the present, but also our historic past. And so we have the church here. And then across the street, the Masonic Lodge, the first black Masonic Lodge in Niles, it started here. The first black Masonic Lodge in Michigan started here, and that's just across the street. Now, the building is not the current building from that time period. We're still in a process of kind of identifying where people were living, and where some of their buildings might be. We don't know if the original building was there or not, but we do know that there are representatives just across the street, and still a historic building. It seems to be a 1922 building, but we have people there that have been holding on to the tradition of black masonry, but also are very much interested now in helping continue to uncover the history of that organization, both here in Niles, but also to be able to look at the import of it cross-culturally, across geographic boundaries. Because we know that the folks that were involved in the foundation, people like John J. Evans and his wife of the First Lodge, were folks that were integral in the Underground Railroad, that were integral in anti-slavery activity, and then continued their political activity once slavery was over. So the folks that were involved in that lodge are particularly critical to us understanding our history here in Niles. But those are just three buildings. There are a number of places that we have addresses for in the surrounding area to make an even stronger case for this being a budding historic district, that there were people who were involved in the Lincoln Jubilee, the 1915 Lincoln Jubilee that brought together black folks from all over the country to be able to identify 50 years after emancipation, where did we stand in terms of progress? What were some of the accomplishments that we'd made? And then also, what were some areas that we still needed to address? And folks came together, and we had a good contingency of folks here from Niles that were either landowners, property owners, business owners, or involved as a delegate going to this Jubilee, this national peace. And so through that, and also looking at some of the city directories in the area, we're even more fully being able to identify that this was a significant community, a sizable community of black people along here on Ferry Street. There was also an artist who lived on the street, Lottie Wilson, I believe was her last name, who did a painting of Abraham Lincoln and Sojourner Truth, that famous meeting that they had together. I don't know if she was there at that. I don't know if she's drawing from information that's been passed on to her, but she lived just at the end of one of these streets, and a very fascinating individual, not just as an artist, but as someone that was engaged in community and political activity, and came from a family who had been engaged in that as well. So that's just 4 buildings, and those aren't the houses of people who lived on Cass Street or people who lived in surrounding areas, creating a very strong foundation for a vibrant black community that people don't necessarily know about. I just, in Kalamazoo, about a month and a half ago, I was walking around and I ran into this woman who was with her boyfriend, and I knew her just like on the side, and she said, "So what are you doing?" I was telling her about this statewide project that I'm working on, and I said that I've been doing work in Niles, and she said, "Niles? I'm from Niles." I said, "Well, your city had it going on historically," and she smacked her boyfriend in the arm. She said, "I told you we had stuff in Niles," and he was from Detroit, and he's like, and so he had this impression. People have this quite frequently, I think, that all the news that was fit to print happened on the east side of the state, and a lot of really amazing things happened. I feel allegiances to all places in the state, but we snooze quite frequently on Southwest Michigan and places like Niles, places like Cass County, Cassopolis, Vandalia, even Van Buren County. In Van Buren County, it was the second highest number of black property owners in the state of Michigan in 1910. Who knew that? And we're talking about people with hundreds of acres of land. And so to be able to continue to elevate this history of Niles, this history of this particular geographic location in which we sit, the blocks surrounding us, to be able to elevate that to a place does a great deal to understand the complexity of our history, to understand that we aren't solely just an urban community or solely a rural community historically, but that we are far more complicated. And then to be able to elevate these positions that people made for themselves and made for each other, of economic strength, of economic self-determination, of identifying how and when and where we're going to educate our children, and how we are also going to come together to address the political and social issues that we face, to be able to take a look at that and to say, in 1850 and 1860 and 70, and for all those decades, we had people making a world for themselves and making a world for each other right here, as far as we can see.
Dr. Johnson, why is that important for, let's say, today's young person to know this?
Well, absolutely. This is a question that we talked about a little bit earlier in a previous meeting, I believe it's something very strongly about applied history, that, it's great to have all these facts in our head and, to know where we came from, but to know where we come from is critical, but to know where we're going is equally important. And we can utilize this history, I fundamentally believe, to understand all the strategies. There's really, we might have to combine all of them, but we don't have a whole lot of new strategies from what we had in the 19th century. We still have political strategies, educational strategies, economic strategies, policy strategies, and everybody's tried them, right? And so when we go back into history, then we start to see, okay, this is what worked, this is maybe not what worked, and let's be able to take history and then be able to combine something that is going to help us now, because we've made advancements, but Ida B. Wells, who was one of the organizers of the Lincoln Jubilee, was talking significantly and came to the fore talking about lynching and the killing of black men. So we can learn from those folks about how did they address those issues of inequity and violence and confinement and self-determination.
But, speaking of that, you look at 1851, and I believe in 1850, President Millard Fillmore put more juice into the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant no matter where a black person was outside of the slave states, he could be taken back south and put back into slavery. Now, looking at today, and we're looking at what you see on the news, how policemen have been doing black people across the country. Back then, if a government person approached a black person that had papers showing he was free, would that really make a difference?
Back then or now? Has it ever made a difference? I guess that's ultimately my question, or my answer is I don't know that we've made some, I'd have to sit down and talk about some of those places, but we've made some strides. But we are still in some of the same places that we were during the Fugitive Slave Act. Like Sandra Bland driving through Texas, driving while black with a sense of who she was. No, things have not changed all that differently, and that's why again I think that like being able to look at the work of we're kind of, in fact I'd say we are kind of redoing the work that Ida B. Wells did on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Ida B. Wells was the newspaper. She had the Red Record. She wrote a book about lynching. So we're still doing some of the same stuff, but I fundamentally believe that if more of the people who are writing about Black Lives Matter also knew about Ida B. Wells, that we could be able to, we wouldn't have to feel like we keep starting from scratch again with like, that this is a brand new question. These aren't brand new questions. Your question is, go ahead.
But I gotta interject here. But a lot of people across society tell you to forget about the past, and you have black people echoing those same sentiments. Forget about the past, that stuff is no longer important, and they fall victims to stupidity.
I agree because, they say that if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. And it's a little bit cliche, but I think it's very true. And so projects like this, like what you're doing, this project for the state of Michigan where we're identifying places, we're identifying people, and we're bringing them to a place of visibility is one of the answers. Ultimately, do we have to escape to Canada? I'm not sure. That was one of the options that people had then. We certainly know that there are places where it's not policy to kill black people just every day.
Didn't mean to cut you off, but I was watching on the internet today, a gentleman, I forgot his name, just wrote a book talking about it wasn't that much different. In Canada, they still had the same issues to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This is not to say that either then or now that Canada is free of racism, classism, homophobia, all of those things. I would not say that at all. But I would say that they don't have a policy, an accepted policy of killing black people. In the United States, we still accept that black people are criminal and that they deserve to die, or if they don't, it doesn't really, maybe they don't deserve to die, but it's not really that important. We have a policy where just about every day a black person is either brutalized, harassed, or killed in this country. I'm not hearing that about Canada. Now, I'm not saying Canada's got everything down or any place else in the world, but we have some systematic structures that we have to address and understand their historical implications and their present implications in order to try to come up with something different. And I continue to go back to people like Frederick Douglass and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and George de Baptiste and William Lambert and J.W. Hackley and all of the folks that I study to continue to identify the strategies that folks have used to publicize those strategies, to continue to hope for something other than the Sisyphusian rolling of the boulder up the hill and let it go back down and then go back down and get the boulder and roll it back up. Perhaps that's our life. Perhaps that's who we are as people who seek social justice and equity, is that we're just going to have to keep doing it over and over and over again. I don't know. That doesn't sound like a very optimistic perspective to me, but it could potentially be that, where we just keep moving and keep trying to move slowly in a direction that moves us away from the exploitation and the confinement that we've experienced for centuries.
What I found is a central ingredient to the exploitation that we've had to keep confronting is a lot of times we became voluntarily divided and conquered.
Absolutely. And the degree to which sometimes we invest in systems that aren't necessarily sustainable. We certainly know that as Black folks, we believed really strongly that if we got the same pie that European American folks or white people got, then it'd be all good without questioning the pie. Is that pie any good for us? Is that something we should be trying to make for ourselves and freeze and pass on to our children? I'm not so sure. And so I think that's where some of that struggle comes, is we have, as Black people historically, we have embraced and perpetuated some of the very systems that have sought to confine us. And so the degree to which we buy in sometimes to those things, those ideologies that are intended to keep us in a particular place, I think is a degree to which we'll continue to be able to be divided and conquered.
Now, what you're saying there, that's everybody who the United States deals with. That's the same strategy, no matter where you are. With the Indians here, divide and conquer. Anywhere that America, I love America. I have my tie to prove it. And but I have noticed that wherever they go, that divide and conquer, it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I have a poem. Someone said, Michelle, you're not the typical American, and I don't consider myself a poet. People say maybe I am, but I was like, I am an American. I'm the American like Henry David Thoreau and Frederick Douglass that have said we can have a better place. We don't have to keep doing things in the same old status quo that we're doing. George de Baptiste, all these folks that I study and that inspirit me. And have for so long. The Maroons, my goodness, the Maroons of Louisiana, all the people who escaped from slavery, those are the folks that continue to inspire me. And those people are American. We think that we forget that that those folks are as integral in forming an American identity that sometimes we try to hide away, but it's just as strong and just as present.
But Dr. Johnson, a lot of times those same people are called crazy by their friends and the people in their communities.
Well, people thought Frederick Douglass was crazy. People thought Audrey. Not everybody, but so what? Quite frankly, at this point, I know for me, and I know for some of the people I know, that the tribe that I run with, either across generations or currently, I'm cool with going with their brand of crazy, because the status quo is, quite frankly, what's crazy. An unsustainable system that requires that people are not their authentic selves, that's crazy. And so at this point, I've gotten to a place where, go ahead, call me crazy, call me nuts, but I got documentation for my nuts.
Too bad you're on a time schedule. Because you're saying some things here that we could be here all day, because people, well, let me ask it this way. How did you learn to step outside the box and think? Because what you're describing is people are within the box, and if they step outside the box, they're ostracized.
Well, I was born outside of the box, so I had to learn how to get comfortable with it from a very early age. As a woman, as a Black person, as a 4-year-old integrating a white school in Saginaw, with neighbors throwing rocks at me and calling me nigger. I stepped out of the box pretty much as soon by probably 4, and with having parents who were not the same quote unquote race. I came, like I've never really been in a box. I've had people try to get me back in it, but growing up in Saginaw and looking and watching how racial division worked geographically, how you got mostly black people and Latino people and a handful of white people on the east side, and just the inverse on the west side, a city that was so dependent and focused on the automobile industry that was not necessarily sustainable, and to not necessarily be, I didn't have family who worked in the automobile industry, so they were in education and in construction, and so I grew up, I wasn't in that box either, and so I grew up thinking unions were really important, but I wasn't never in there. I was a girl who played drums and softball and liked to run and race and study, and so that wasn't a normal box either. So I've been out here for a long time. Always loved to read. I started reading Frederick Douglass when I was in 4th grade or something like that. And you can't read Frederick Douglass, I don't think, and not be changed and not see the world in a different way, especially growing up in a society that still had very rigid expectations and violent expressions of racism, violent expressions of misogyny around me. Yeah, and then you go to college at Michigan State and have exposure to amazing people like Harry Reid, who was one of my professors, and Linda Beard, and some of my feminist professors like Marilyn Fry and Catherine Fishburne, and then going on to the University of Michigan and having, in addition to really amazing professors, really amazing fellow graduate students who were continuing to push and being part of a movement to, at the time that I went to the University of Michigan, to have a broader representation of people who had been traditionally marginalized in the academy, and so to be a part of that constituency of folks kept pushing me. But I don't think I've ever stayed. That's a long way to say how I've gotten more comfortable out of the box over the years, but I've never really been in it.
As we wind down here, how did you become, what was it about history that motivated you to go so far in it? And speaking of your academic background, how did you go so far with this subject area?
Okay. Well, for a long time I wanted to be a lawyer because I've felt really strongly just about my whole life about finding ways to make the world a more equitable place, to have more fairness and justice. But I always loved to read. And so as an undergraduate, my undergraduate, I was focusing on elementary education because I thought, the solution to the world's problems are young people. And then I thought, oh, well, no. As I started looking more, I went to James Madison at Michigan State, and that was a minority-majority group relationship program for people who were interested in pre-law or going into law, because I thought that's the problem. After growing up in Saginaw, I'd gotten some classes. It's like, oh, I see, these dynamics, these social dynamics. That's the solution. And then I was like, because I'm always trying to find the solution to the world's problems. And then the next thing I thought, well, that's not it. It's an individual. We have to get to the individual. The individual is gone. So I transferred to psychology, and then I stopped altogether. And I quit for about 1.5 years. And when I decided to come back, I decided that part of the solution was also me doing what I loved. I loved reading. I loved reading novels. I loved reading history. I especially loved reading novels that illustrated history, and went to this really amazing conference. It was the Black Women Writers in the Diaspora Conference, my senior year of college at Michigan State. And there were people like Octavia Butler and Audre Lorde and Alexis DeVoe and Barbara Smith and Ellen Kutzweil, these amazing black women who were speaking their truth and speaking their voice, but they were also really interested in the intersection of culture and history. And there was one particular author, Michelle Cliff. She is still a Jamaican author. And she wrote a novel called Abeng. And Abeng was about the Maroon societies and Nanny, the leader of the Maroons in Jamaica. And this, the central character, I haven't read it in so many years, but I think her name was Claire, but I'm not exactly sure. She doesn't know her history, and so the novel is her finding out more about Nanny and more about the Maroons at Accompong. And so what happens is she heals in the course of this novel from knowing her history. And I was like, that's it. The more we know our history, the more we can heal, the more we can create something new. I went away, I worked in recycling, because remember, I'm still trying to find the solution to the world's problems. I've got this little piece, and now I'm looking out, I'm living in New Mexico, and people are throwing their cans out the window. I'm like, we got to do something about the environment. And so, long story short, I decided to go back to graduate school, and I made a really hard decision between managing a recycling company in Taos, New Mexico, or going to Ann Arbor to the history department, which subsequently became American culture for me. And what drew me back, what took me back to graduate school, was wanting to know how African-retained religions were integral in resistance to slavery, and particularly African-retained religions in their understanding their relationship with the natural world. And so my dissertation then was all about, my research was all about finding out, we knew what some of the tropes were for European Americans and their relationship with the land and what we have as a result of that. We had some ideas about indigenous people's understanding of the relationship with the land and what we have or don't have as a result of that. But we didn't have this conversation about black people, and black people have been, as soon as we got here, we were working with the land in some way, and our history has always been integrally connected to space, place, and nature. And so I went back to graduate school to pursue that. Not always sure that I had made the right decision through almost my entire graduate school experience. Just about every day I was like, I should be in New Mexico. But that is what took me back to academia. And what brought me out of academia was the work of Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston was a part of my PhD dissertation, but her work in public scholarship, the importance of being out in the community to formulate the questions that go back to the academy and to formulate the answers that go back to the academy became a real strong focus for me. So
The academy?
The academy, college, teaching in the university level. And so when I was at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee with my first job, I went down and followed behind Zora Neale Hurston, went to the communities that she collected folklore in, like Eatonville and Loftman and Belle Glade, and got to know, I met people who knew some of the people that Hurston had collected folklore from, and became really involved with an organization. At that moment it was called the Friends of Tripoli, to put on the first production of a play that Hurston had co-written with Dorothy Waring called Polk County, which was a representation of this community that I was working with. And the people in the community are the ones who did the first reading of this play that Hurston had wrote. And that's when I said, this is the kind of stuff I want to do. Yes, I took students with me, and they participated in the project, and they've gone on to graduate school and getting their PhDs and masters, in large part because of something like this. But really what resonated with me was putting a key in a community center to have the rehearsal, to have it, taking these intellectual conversations that I'd been having, with myself and with other academics and in papers, to a different setting, and to see how they were reshaped, and maybe even maybe people weren't even asking the right questions, and sometimes not coming up with the right answers at all. And that's when I knew that I was a public scholar. I was a public historian. I was a community scholar, a community historian, and that's what I wanted to be. That it's cool to be in the classroom. I like that, but this right here, the people that I sat around the table with at the Fort St. Joseph Museum. Yes, and and to be at a table with people like that is fulfilling in a way that quite frankly, I don't get in the classroom, because these are folks that are on the ground doing the work and invested in the landscape of our culture. And so that's a very long-winded answer to how I come here, because I fundamentally believe that not only the degree to which we know our history, and that we can come together around understanding our history. When we do that, that creates opportunities for important dialogues about the present. That creates important networks in the present. And so that coming together to talk about and think about history implicitly brings people to think about where we are today. And if we decide we're going to do some kind of action together, it takes us into the future, and then we'll continue to be fueled by that past in productive and healing and hopefully regenerative ways.
Dr. Johnson, you've made my day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing this, Eric. Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching.